Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar, ERM, Responding to the Post-Pandemic Economy and Regulatory Guidance. My name is Jeff Rigsby. I'm the President and CEO of CB Resource, and I will be presenting today's session. First, I do want to take this opportunity to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. I know that could be challenging these days, and we certainly appreciate it and respect it. And with that said, I know we indicated that this session will run about 45 minutes, and I certainly intend to keep to that schedule. For those of you that aren't familiar with CB Resource, just to let you know, we are based in Irvine, California. We do serve community bank clients across the country. We do three things: enterprise risk management, strategic planning, and capital planning. And we specialize specifically in ensuring our community bank clients' performance and risk management priorities are in sync, and they're positioned in good times and bad for optimal performance. So let's get started. And I guess I should say before we get started, just a couple of quick words on the webinar itself. We do have instant messaging, so to the extent you want to ask a question during the course of the presentation, feel free to do so. I do like to keep these things on a conversational level. We will also have a brief Q&A at the end of the presentation. These materials are available to you. By all means, just send us an email, send us a note via GoToWebinar, give us a call. There will also be a recorded version, and I hope you've all received a complimentary copy of CB Risk Radar report. That is something that comes along with the webinar. We think you'll find it useful. It's a great snapshot to provide you with your current risk profile based on key risk indicators, both in terms of historic perspective and indicating some future trends. Now, I always like to kind of extend what my purpose is in these sessions, and today is pretty straightforward. What I'd like to accomplish today with you all is explore how ERM could be an effective tool, both in terms of responding to the pandemic and pandemic-related risk, but also being a vehicle to serve your regulatory response or communication mechanism, right? So pretty straightforward. Let's talk about how ERMs can better serve you during a pandemic and how it can also serve you in dealing with regulatory communication. What we're going to cover today, I do want to do a brief flyover on just the pandemic impact and certain key considerations. If you really think about it, if you haven't heard from your regulators, and I know, but just here in California, there was a specific written communication from the Department of Business Oversight indicating what they're looking for in future visits as it relates to the pandemic and risk management around that. But I do want to do a quick flyover on the economic impact, because that is kind of what's stimulating or generating the interest from the regulators on knowing what you're doing. We'll talk about specifically what that guidance looks like, and this is information we've gleaned from regulators directly as well as our clients. And then what I want to do is integrate or weave in what we would characterize as the 5 non-negotiables of ERM. And by doing so, it's like, if this is what the regulators are looking for, and this is what an ERM platform does, can we spend the balance of our time looking at those overarching areas of focus, right? So how does ERM play a role in helping me manage risk during the pandemic, as well as communicating with my regulators, and then wrap up with some closing thoughts and questions. Great. So a quick look at the economy. I think we've been in the pandemic now for a while. It's funny, I've been referring to it as post-pandemic. I don't think we're in post-pandemic yet, but what we do know is at a national and global perspective, it's had high impact, right? We've seen GDP kind of fall through the roof. We've seen sectors significantly have an adverse impact, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But in short, I think it's fair to say that the pandemic has had a material impact, and for those of us that have been in the industry a long time, we've lived through a lot of different cycles, if you will, credit cycles and economic cycles. But it's fair to say I've been in the industry about 35 years, and in my lifetime or in my experience level, I've never seen anything quite the magnitude of what we're managing through today. So first of all, it's had really global and national impact. Now, interesting is you start drilling down and think about the pandemic impact, and this might be why the regulators are a little concerned. What are the big guys doing, right? What are the big banks doing right now? Well, if you take a look specifically at their loan loss provision line, and if you look at this trend in this middle big hump there, that was the Great Recession, right? That goes back to 07, 09, and 10, and they were reserving at a high level. And then we entered into this longest prosperity and favorable credit cycle that we've seen in a long time. And then as we roll into Q1 and 2, provisions are on the rise. And we can ask ourselves rhetorically, what does that say? And when you think about big banks, they're trying to get out in front of the curve. And they believe that there's going to be some credit impact and some adverse credit impact. So from those of us from a community bank perspective, what's that tell us? Well, that could be a positive, right? If big banks are thinking that there's trouble ahead, then they're likely going to tighten and they're likely going to cut costs. And both of those behaviors may serve you as a community bank well. But long and short of it is they're reserving up. And for those of you, about a week and a half ago or so, Jamie Dimon was out there talking, and he said the interesting thing about today is we're in the midst of a recession, but nobody's going to really know it until we roll into Q4. And if you think about it, a lot of that has to do with all this stimulus in the marketplace. Have we really felt the impact of the pandemic, of COVID-19? And is that something that our regulators are sensitive to? When we take a look at the recovery trajectory, we've talked about U-shaped recoveries and V-shaped and W-shaped, and whatever it is, more experts than not are suggesting it's got some legs to it, right? It's maybe not be as V-shaped as we all hoped. And if you look at the conference board's consensus in kind of this black track right here, their mid-track, which is what they would view as their base case, it's a journey, right? If this line is where we started, this is our journey back, and we're out here at the end of 2021. So we're talking 5-6 quarters out on the approach back to that baseline. And this is what's interesting, right? And you could look at a lot of different charts, but behavior is changing. When we take a look at digital delivery and a remote workforce, whether it's from a consumer perspective, whether it's those of you working in a bank that hasn't seen your office in 4 or 5 months, whether it's the behaviors of digital delivery and you're buying everything from Amazon or Walmart or Target versus going into your local stores, it's messing with the rules of engagement, right? Our customer behavior is changing. And again, going back to why are regulators so interested in our response in this pandemic environment is the assumption is our world's changing, and it's changing in terms of economic conditions, but it's also changing in terms of behavior. And what does that do to your strategy and your profile? We are in this low interest rate environment, and the Fed, unless they come out and change their direction, we're probably 6-8 quarters into a prolonged low interest rate environment. And what does that do to our environment? And so as you think about it again, is have we taken these factors into consideration? And are we looking at the future as something that we need to tighten, that we need to perhaps stay the course, or we need to lean in? And with all the uncertainty running around it, we may not have a clear view of what that really is. And just a couple of other quick data points. This prolonged weak employment impact has really been sector specific, hasn't it? And for those of you in the CRE space, and you've got maybe some elevated CRE concentrations, and let's say you happen to be in the hospitality or retail sector, there's something to be thinking about there, right? That environment's changing. And what is the recovery period of that? And how do we gear into that? And is there a role for ERM to help us do that? When we think of Class A commercial space, are our clients, or are we directly looking at changing and leveraging up a remote workforce? And is that going to shrink our corporate footprint or our clients' corporate footprint? And what does that do to commercial real estate? So a lot of things going on it could be rooted in employment numbers, but they're tea leaves in terms of where this all is going. But excuse me, but when you sum it all up, and as we start thinking about communicating with our regulators and making our own business decisions, credit is likely to take a hit, right? I mean, if we take a look at key sectors, it may not be as big for you as others, but the likelihood of credit taking a hit is out there. And when you think of most of you in this room and what regulators are most concerned about is somewhere between 50 and 70% of your risk resides in credit. And so how does that going to impact your business? And, and that certainly could be sector driven. And, you know, strangely enough, we rolled into this pandemic, and part of it, the earliest stages, you know, oil and gas went into this crazy, you know, death spiral because of what was going on between Russia and ERM nations. And that took a big hit in oil and gas. So if you're down at that end, if you're in an oil and in gas or energy sensitive sector, that has an additional factor, right? But just summing it up, pandemic's been good for digital delivery. Hey, if you're in the digital market, if you're delivering things in a remote fashion, you've accelerated your strategy 3 to 5 years. Amazon, as I mentioned, Amazon, Walmart, Target, these guys are all up 75%. You know, and if you're leveraging up workforce, Twitter's told its employees they don't ever have to come back if they're working remotely. They can adapt. They're finding they're productive. So, you know, there's winners and losers in everything, but the pandemic has been good for digital delivery and other technology-enabled opportunities, but it's also taken some hits, right? And so those are the losers on that side. And in many respects, it's at the expense of mature business models, and it's affected the norms. The lowest interest rate environment is probably going to be with us for a while. Oops. Gosh, my computer's taken off on its own. Uncertainty abound, and the one takeaway, though, which I think could be favorable, if larger banks are likely to tighten and cut costs, for many of you on this call, that could be a good opportunity. But these are factors, and I wanted to put these out here. We're going to spend the rest of our time talking about, you know, regulatory guidance and how ERM fits and all that stuff. But it's kind of nice to look at the lay of the land. There is a method to the madness. Regulators are growing hypersensitive because there's a lot of uncertainty, but the tea leaves kind of suggest the road ahead could be a tough one. And we'll see how that plays out, right? So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about regulatory guidance and tie that back into what I mentioned earlier, which were the kind of the non-negotiables. So these bullets were extracts directly from regulator communication. So not making these up. These are published notes that have gone out and said, hey, next time you see us, or what we are likely to be thinking about and interested in are these factors, right? And one of the general overarching statements that came out of that generally is they're talking about your approach to risk management, right? And they're saying generally, you know, a risk management is, a risk is effectively managed when it identifies, measures, monitors, controls, and reports risk, right? So they're first giving you this hierarchy is, you know, whatever you're doing out there, we want to see something that helps you identify, measure, monitor, and control risk, right? So that's an overarching kind of framework. But then what are some of the specific things that they were saying that they're going to be looking for? And, you know, and this, guys, if nothing else, if you leave this webinar after this moment in time, this will be a good checklist for you when you get back to the branch and kind of figure out how you want to respond to all these things. But output should address changes in strategy, personnel, operations, outlook. Interesting, right? They want to know, you know, what this environment is doing to change and change you. The institution's capital levels must also be considered when given losses or potential losses from the pandemic. Closer looks at credit risk and interest rate risk will be conducted, right? The risk assessment should discuss how the local recovery is progressing and additional challenges that presents. So they're asking to have a forward look in a environmental or an inside looking outlook, right? The risk assessment should place great emphasis on how well the institution has identified and managed risk arising from the pandemic. So what is your system, right, to percolate these topics to the surface and evaluate its overall impact or lack of impact? And I will say today, in many cases, when I'm working with clients on any given day, it's like, Jeff, we know stuff's going on out there, but we haven't really necessarily felt the impact from an earnings or performance basis yet, right? The risk assessment will provide examiners with information on how any challenges related to the pandemic are being addressed. So they're peeling back the onion, right? They want to know that you're taking all these factors into consideration and responding to them. The risk assessment should cover the full scope of how the pandemic affected your institution's operations and financial condition. And, you know, that's a tall order, but that's in the communication. And then lastly, and what we did is we captured and grabbed like what we thought were the top 7, you know, areas of expectation from a regulatory perspective. But that additional one was senior management should report to the board on the overall risk profile, including aggregate risk. And you know what, guys, there's so many words in ERM for this, but you might use the word aggregate. And OCC, I think, uses aggregate. FRB uses composite risk. Most ERM systems will speak to residual risk. However you want to define it, there is the risk profile, which says, what's my inherent risk? What's the adequacy of my management and controls? What's the aggregate or residual risk, and where is this risk going? And by all means, they want to hear about emerging risk and threats, right? So those are kind of the checklist. So if that's the checklist, let me just spend just a brief moment on what I would suggest as you look at your own system or evaluate adopting ERM as an internal discipline, is take these things into consideration. So, and if you're familiar with COSO is the guys that kind of created the architecture for ERM, right? And you can leaf through all their stuff and read all their materials, but in the end, in their most recent 2017 edition, their capstone to this whole thing is ERM is a way to manage risk in creating, preserving, and realizing value. And to me, that's the piece of the definition I embrace. It's about performance. It's about optimal performance. So I just leave you with that. But these are the 5 elements as you look at reporting to regulators and what your system does that are non-negotiable. It better be in there, right? So if you think about it, risk appetite. So right at the tip of the spear, your risk appetite is what clearly defines the level of risk you're willing to take. And by what category, by what area of risk? It defines what your key risk indicators and key performance indicators are, or your tolerance levels. It calibrates your assessment system. So don't dismiss the tip of the spear of any good ERM system as your risk appetite is an indicator of what level of risk you're willing to take in good times and bad. So make sure your risk appetite is clearly articulated. The risk assessment itself, which is kind of that nucleus of a good ERM system, is does it effectively take a look at the key risk categories you want to assess? And if it's automated, great. If it's a Excel model, great. But is it looking at both qualitative and quantitative data? The qualitative stuff is your interpretation of inherent risk and your controls and direction. The quantitative data is actual measurements that indicate where you are within your risk tolerance levels. But you want your system to do that in a seamless manner. And you want it to aggregate and roll up to useful information that serves management and the board, right? Number 3, top risk mitigation. Does your process identify those top risks? So if you think about it, risk appetite says what you're willing to do. Your risk assessment is your mechanism to quantify the level of risk you're taking on and how well you're controlling it and where it's going. But that risk assessment should also percolate emerging risk and threats, which may evolve to something called a top risk. And does your top risk, have you identified it in such a way that you can determine its impact potentially on earnings or capital or value creation, right? So do you have a top risk identification mechanism in that platform? And then, from just a robust operating system, it needs to effectively track and report, right? And is it a routine system that tells you where risk is today, where it's been, and where it's likely to go? Remember, ERM is about a forward-looking discipline. And that's where, in this tracking and reporting, you can hopefully also communicate emerging risk and threats. And lastly, we just always talk about manageability. Make sure your system is serving you and you're not serving it. It should be a nice blend of good technology and subject matter expertise. Sometimes we adopt these major systems and it takes so much labor, we become a slave to the system as opposed to the system serving us. So just a little helpful insight. So, and last comment, and then let's talk about these outputs, right? But if you think about it, an ERM system is a system. It's a process. And that doesn't mean it's necessarily technology. It means it's a process, right? It has components. And so if you think about those overarching components from a regulatory requirement standpoint, there's their 4 components, right? Think of it as pillars. So as you look at your ARM system or a system you might want to adopt, think about what does it do to identify risk specifically? What does it do to measure risk? Is there a component to that? How does it monitor it, right? What's the distribution? In other words, who gets what and when, and what does it tell them? Audiences are different. What the board gets isn't what your risk committee gets. But that's what risk monitoring is all about. Figuring out who needs to see what to make better decisions. or to stimulate good conversation. And then lastly, the control mechanism, if all this stuff is working, you can, as I would put it strategically, you could tighten, right? It might cause you to pull back a little bit. It might say, hey, we're good, business as usual, stay the course. Or, you know what, I see opportunity here. While everybody's kind of pulling back, I'm going to lean in and move forward. But that's what your control dials do for you, right? It allows you to respond to this free flow of information. And then it's a continuous improvement process. And now this happens to be a flow chart for a top down. And what this does is basically says risk appetite, strategic intent, and capital are all considered before we go down the path, right? And if we do that at the tip of the spear, now we can identify, measure, monitor, and control risk. And it's a continuous improvement process. Now, just because I'm linear in my thinking, I always like to think, so let's take those 7 regulatory components and just talk about how it might fit. And so you guys might find this as a useful grid. So if you want the presentation, by all means. But when you're assessing what any one of these components might do, here's a little sample to look at how they can help you out. And let's do that. Let's go ahead and dive in. And I may not be able to drill in specifically on every step of this, but I hope that I can share some concepts and some visuals and some images that can help you create and dial in to what you want to do on your risk management side. And by the way, I'm talking about regulators coming into this. How can ERM, support your ability to respond to these growing regulatory requirements? But this is just good stuff, right? This helps us run our business. This helps us perform at an optimal level. So let's take it by those 5 core disciplines we talked about and start with risk appetite. And if you recall, one of their key things is output should address changes in strategy, in personnel, and operations, and outlook. Well, think about what your risk appetite is. And I hope most of you have done this, and this is something you can do on the back of a napkin. You can do it with technology enabled, but it's a serious discipline about management and the board getting together and answering the question, what are we willing to do or not do to make money and create value? That's what risk appetite does, right? And we suggest, in order to effectively communicate with your regulators, you can follow a CAMELS framework. You can take any model you want. OCC's got its own matrix, so does FRB. But in essence, what they're really interested in seeing is risk from a credit risk perspective, an interest rate risk perspective, liquidity, operational risk, compliance risk, strategic risk, reputation risk, cyber. If you've got business groups like mortgage and trust or payment systems, all those are unique categories that you can build risk appetite about. And what does your risk appetite, what question does that answer? Well, guess what, guys? It answers the question of your strategy, because it indicates how much you're willing to do or not do. It answers the question of your resource alignment. It answers the question of what your operations look like. If you're going all in on a digital platform or a digital bank, or you're leveraging technology, and either technology is a standalone risk category, or it's embedded in operational risk, that's where you make the message of, hey, my risk appetite's kind of moderate to high because I'm making a major investment in technology. So that would tilt your operational risk up, but your regulators probably want to know that, so does your board, right? So that's what risk appetite does. So if you think about it, spend time figuring out how much risk you're willing to take by category, and you're recreating this initial framework of communication, right? And once you've got that heat map, take that next step and define it further. So when you say that your credit risk is moderate to high, tell me why. And that your risk appetite and credit might go moderate high right now because you're going to grow more. You want to take more business from others because you think others are tightening, and you're going to go out and get more. So that's going to elevate your credit risk, but you think it's good business. So you want to develop a risk appetite statement that articulates that, right? That help people understand what you're willing to do. And then lastly, the money shot. Risk appetite, either in the form of key performance indicators or key risk indicators. And what you're seeing to the right here is your way of saying, hey, my risk appetite might be low, moderate to moderate, but how does risk move? What are my tolerance levels? And my tolerance levels are articulated low to high, right? So that's what I'm going to express. And guys, what you're looking at is the basis of a dashboard. So does it fit a lot of regulatory information that they might want to see? It certainly does. Does it also fit your strategic intent and information that's useful for you, absolutely. And if you're reporting up to the board and you can tell them where you are in your risk tolerance levels, that's a good thing. So when we think about it from risk appetite and say, so Jeff, what's that got to do with regulatory needs? It's got a lot to do with it. It's telling them not just where you are today, but it's telling them what your intent is, and especially what your intent. If you do your risk appetite today, I'm guessing you're considering the impact of the pandemic, either currently or in a post-economic environment. Okay, so that's kind of risk appetite. But let's talk about risk assessment. You know, we talked about, they said in many of their cases, you need to have this risk assessment. So what does that risk assessment look like? What does it need to have? And it really is pretty straightforward, right? It's the home of your risk profile. And a couple of their risk assessment questions that I picked up on or statements were, the risk assessment should discuss capital levels or let me back up, I'm sorry. The risk assessment should discuss how the local recovery is progressing or additional challenges and changes, or the risk assessment should place an emphasis on communicating your risk profile. So if you think about it, here's just a good way to look at a risk assessment. And guys, this could be an Excel spreadsheet. Don't really, care how you get there, but here's your key risk categories, right? And within operational risk, you probably have, at least a half a dozen subset categories. But these are the qualitative questions, right? What is my inherent risk? And adopt a system that somehow can assign some sort of numeric value, low to high, 1 to 5, however you're getting there. But you want to be able to say what your inherent risk is by these categories. You want that aggregate result. You want an aggregate result that measures the quality of your controls, the adequacy of your management. You want something that, whether you want to call it composite risk, residual risk, or aggregate risk, they're asking to see that, and obviously direction. So think about setting up some sort of dashboard or means. And if you could put your risk appetite on the front end, that's kind of a value add. But you want to capture those risk categories, and you want to go deeper, right? So if you see compliance risk, well, there's probably BSA in there. There's fair lending in there. There's deposit risk. So all of those additional risks fall within these categories. But what's also important is the quantitative aspect of it, right? This is what most assessments do. They ask questions and you answer them. But from an ERM standpoint, you need to quantify those through KPIs and KRIs as well. And this is just an example of it. Figure out what they are, figure out what your risk tolerance levels are or triggering levels, and track it, right? And in this case, you can see an example. There's a clicker here to go through credit risk, interest rate risk, liquidity, price, operational compliance. And operational and compliance are kind of tough, right? That's a little tougher to get into quantitative measure, but you've got to do it. And you'll be glad you did, right? So these are just kind of the first thing you want your risk assessment to do is profile your overall risk profile, or I'm sorry, your profile to profile. But that's what you want it to do. Capture those 4 key elements, both quantitatively and qualitatively. You want it to drill down. Remember, they asked the question, they want to see what the overall impact is across the enterprise in all risk categories, not just finance, not just capital, not just earnings. So you want to be able to drill down so that risk assessment system can reflect what's going on in those categories. So when you say, hey, my operational risk is trending up in these areas, and it's to do or not to do with the pandemic, but you do want to have the ability to drill down further in your assessment so that you can look at each of these categories and you can answer the question, has this environment, stayed the same? Has it changed my risk profile? And again, how is that affected in these key categories? Inherent risk, adequacy of risk management, composite, and direction. And if you can produce a report like this, I guarantee you there is comfort with regulators, but you'll probably find comfort at the board as well. And then lastly, granular is good. Get right on down to where that issue is. If it's a credit issue and it happens to be, due to concentrations in hospitality loans, well, you want to get granular and be able to drill down and see that. If there's a certain demographic in your market that's exiting the market or suffering in the market, you want an element in your risk assessment that says you've identified it. So you do, I've kind of looked at 3 different elements of what the risk assessment should do, but there's at least 4 of those requests from a regulatory standpoint that wants this kind of data that, I guess in short, they want to see how you make sausage when it comes down to assessing your risk. But guys, are we looking at anything that we shouldn't be doing anyway? If driving sustainable, optimal earnings is what we're all about, if we haven't been looking at this data before, don't we want to be? Isn't this kind of a good thing? And one last thing that most ERM systems don't do, and you can do it externally, but one of their big comments is talking to them about where the market around you is going. Well, how are you going to do that? You can do it anecdotally, or you can subscribe to data, but don't forget that when you're trying to figure out how the pandemic's affecting you, you want to kind of see where it's going. You want to be able to tap into any kind of analytics database or reporting system that could give you a forecast out, that could tell you where your markets are going, that could tell you where the industry is going. But that forward-looking data is kind of critical to the overall value of an ERM platform, whether it's for running your own business or for reporting out to regulators. Now, this is kind of the tough one. If you remember, we started with risk appetite in the system, and we talked about the enterprise risk assessment. But the two big things that the regulators brought up in their comments, I think, fall under top risk mitigation. One of those was the risk assessment should place great emphasis on how well the institution has identified and managed risk arising from the pandemic, was one of the instructions. The other one was the risk assessment will provide examiners with information on how any challenges related to the pandemic are being addressed. And guys, this is what I call the hybrid variable of any good ERM system. It's great if it's got a bunch of boilerplate turnkey questions that help you figure out how you're doing. But in some cases, there has to be a way to say, what's an emerging risk and threat look like? So let's just say the pandemic is an emerging risk and threat. And what is it about the pandemic? Well, the pandemic has really, socked the wind out of the retail trade in my market, and retail is closing up. I see shops closing. I'm losing some business there, and I've also got some real estate loans in town that those people are in, and I'm subject to that loss. Well, you need to describe that threat, right? You need to drop it into a window and say, this is my threat. These retailers are leaving, and I'm lending on that property to one guy, and that business is another customer, and I'm losing both. Well, define it and talk about what's the likelihood of that risk getting worse. How bad is that risk going to be? And how severe is it going to be, right? So the first question, is it going to happen? And maybe it's not. And this will be a 1. This will be green. But what if it is going to happen? If it does happen, is it going to be kind of a moderate impact? Or is it going to be a severe impact? But measure it. Where does the risk reside inherently? Figure it out, right? You can build this in a spreadsheet, but figure out where that risk resides. Summarize the level of your controls. Measure your controls. And in the end, if the residual risk is okay, then question asked and answered, right? Our controls are good. We can sleep tonight. Let the board know. Let senior management know. Let the regulators know when they come in. If you're not happy with the residual risk, by all means, nominate mitigating factors that will bring that risk under control. But this stuff is key. I mean, to me, top risk identification, I don't see in a lot of systems out there. I see a lot of, big, huge libraries of assessment data, but I don't see an assessment data bank full of pandemic analysis. So you might have to create your own, but this is the discipline you want to follow. And with that, once you've kind of assessed it, right, you've done the assessment, populate that plan. What is that risk? Who owns it? What are we going to do about it? When is that due? How are we doing on getting there? Doesn't this feel familiar? This is what we do. This is what we do when we plan. As a matter of fact, if you've got a good, robust strategic planning process, take your template and create a risk mitigation plan out of it. It should probably roll back up into your strategy anyway. Right? But I think this is key, whether you're talking about responding to regulators or you as management and with your directors to say, what's going on with this pandemic? Has it changed my world? If not, great. If it has, how has it changed it? And has it changed it for the worse? And how bad is that worse? How well am I controlling it? And do I need to move my dials, right? Do I need to modify my controls? So if that's our top risk, the next thing is tracking and reporting, right? We talked risk appetite, risk assessment, top mitigation, tracking and reporting. And guys, this is where they're kind of saying senior management should report to the board on the overall risk profile, including aggregate risk, including emerging risk. And these are just some image snapshots, right? But here's what I want you to think about. Can you come up with a table or some mechanism that says, hey, here's our risk appetite. Now, this is what we're willing to do and not do to make money. This is our composite risk or residual risk. And sorry, just had something interfere across my line of sight. This is our composite or residual risk. This is the direction, right? Snapshot. Can I report this on some frequency? This is a snapshot right out of the CB risk radar that we gave you, but you have something that looks at KRIs and says, hey, this is how they're moving and this is how it influences my overall profile. So these are just outputs, right? But then when you're thinking about creating a good report, do you have real estate in any kind of report that allows you to summarize where that risk might reside? Is there something going on in banking ops? Is an emerging risk migrating to a remote workforce? And has that changed your cyber threat? Has it changed how you control information and data security? How you maintain the well-being and customer and employee safety? Those are factors. And sometimes you just have to longhand that out. It's not just a data report. It's your articulation of what's going on today and tomorrow. So you want to find a vehicle that kind of summarizes those things. And to the extent you can illustrate, risk movement, that's always key, right? And as that risk moves, am I staying within tolerance levels? Am I moving outside tolerance levels? But this is what tracking and reporting is all about. I mean, imagine the comfort you have if you do have something in place, and many of you I'm sure do, that tell you kind of where risk is moving, where you have the greatest concerns. And does it require a management intervention due to the pandemic? And by the way, an intervention could be, let's do more of something. It's not always do less. It's a pandemic could represent an opportunity, guys and gals. Terrible way to put things. So that kind of captures that. What you're seeing over here is just a simple way of looking at capital, but looking at your risk profile. Remember we talked about your aggregate risk profile. What's your residual or composite risk? Can you look at that and look at how it might influence your capital? And do you need to have a little extra buffer because of the risk you're facing or not? Right? Do you have a report or is a report available? So if they say, what's going on strategically with you? Do you have something that's asked the question, how's my strategy being impacted? Or how is this affecting me strategically? Build something out that looks at strategy. Risk appetite, ERM forces you to kind of say what your risk appetite is. It forces you to develop your risk profile. It forces you to develop key risk or key performance indicators. But all you have to do is continue to redial it, revisit it, right? It was fine at the end of 2019. It was great. We started to think something was moving in Q1. By the time we rolled into late March, April, we were smack dab in it. Did our needle move in Q2? And was it for the good or the better, right? So that's what this is all about. Whether it's strategic risk, operational risk, or any of those categories, can you produce one output that gives you a sense of, where you've been and where you're going? So I just wanted to share that with you visually. Again, these are things that exist. There's companies that do it like us, and many of you are already doing it. But all I'm asking you to do is you think about these emerging regulatory requirements. Risk management is all about better information for better decisions, and better information comes through better outputs. And keep asking yourself, are my outputs providing my ability to have better dialogue, to make better decisions? Right? That's really what we're talking about. And this is an example. So if this is your risk profile and this is your capital indications, PCA well capitalized is here, but the impact of the pandemic on my risk profile takes my minimum capital to here. But hey, here's my policy level and here's my actual level. Boom, I can sleep tonight. It may change next quarter, but as I see today, now my next question is where's it going to go? Same things with things like operational risk, right? So hope that gives you some insight of the types of questions, and this report's available, or this presentation's available to you. But we certainly encourage you to set up a framework that not only responds to your regulators, but responds well to you. To me, any enterprise risk management investment should provide better communication to regulators. It just should, right? I think regulators appreciate it when you're doing it. A really good ERM system makes you a better bank. It helps you create better shareholder value. It helps take some of the surprise out of tomorrow. And adopting these types of disciplines, I assure you, will help decision making in good times and bad a little easier. So here's kind of a grid that shows those questions and where it might reside in your ERM system. And again, you could shuffle these around, but what I guess I'm closing on is think about those frameworks, right? That these things should be in place so that I can accommodate real-time tracking and reporting, as well as forward forecasting, and coming up with a good risk appetite framework and an assessment process and top risk mitigation, tracking and reporting, and making it manageable are the types of things I think that will create a good, robust experience through the pandemic. Meaning, how do we make hay during the pandemic? And if hunkering down and tightening is the right decision for your risk profile, so be it. If staying the course is the right decision, so be it. If leaning into the environment and taking a contrarian strategy to go after more than your fair share, this type of mechanism is going to support your strategy to do it with a high probability of success. So my closing thought, as we think about the pandemic, is well, I wrote this, so I'll just read it. The pandemic has changed the rules of engagement. To a great degree, the magnitude of adverse impact is uncertain, right? We still don't know exactly where everything's going. But whether it's regulatory driven or management driven, ERM can play a material role in how you identify, measure, monitor, and control your risk. And you know what? It's good in good times and bad. We don't have to wait for a pandemic to say we should operationalize an effective enterprise risk management system. So those are kind of my thoughts on that. And I am going to roll into a Q&A period here, and I'm trying to open. I do have some okay, I'm sorry, I'm reading some questions, so I'm trying to be flexible here. So those are my closing thoughts. Let me kind of move on and I'll answer these questions. Okay, just to let you know, before I get to Q&A, this is what we do, guys. So this is my direct appeal to you that if adopting and upgrading or moving into a robust ERM system that can do everything we just talked about, that's what we do. That's what we do for a living. We're good at it. Our clients seem to like it. So I'm going to really encourage you to get in touch with Robert Finch and talk about how we can help your ERM needs. But let me go ahead and respond to these questions. I'm going to take them as presented. And I know I've run up against time, but I'm trying to open my question window. I don't have my assistant here today. Please email to. Thanks. Jeff, we are seeing some competitors doing what we consider to be stupid terms on commercial loans. We see no signs of competitor tightening. How do you combat this? Great question. Great question. And not an uncommon observation. We are seeing what I would call irrational market exuberance, meaning there's a lot of stupid things going on in the market. In this low interest rate environment and a great degree of uncertainty, people's appetite for growth hasn't changed. And in this low rate environment, our existing portfolio clients are at risk, right? There's a bunch of banks going after this. So if you're not seeing tightening yet, that could be a local market phenomenon. I will say that I am seeing tightening at the big bank level in certain markets, but this is a risk tolerance question for you. So when you see this going on, here's my response. See if I could say this simply. If if people are pricing stupid in your market and even making questionable credit quality decisions, I think there's not a whole lot you can do about that. But here's what I do think. If you're a well fine-tuned commercial bank model, and let's say that you've done an above average job of driving down your low cost of funds, and this is where, and for those of you that are embrace strategy, right? Low cost funds of deposits, quality low cost deposits are what drives your franchise value anyway. So whatever your strategy is, it should have a component that says, I'm going to get more low cost deposits than anybody else. If you do have low cost deposits, your risk response to a market that's driving rates down is you probably have more tolerance for marginal return at a low cost of funds basis than the guy next door. So if you don't have low cost of funds, continue to focus on it. If you do have low cost of funds, this is where you might be able to accept a higher degree of price forgiveness than the guy who's coming up with the stupid pricing. So I don't know if that's a good response, but if you've got good low cost of funds, you might take a haircut. But remember, there are people hurting. Just like for those of you that jumped in on PPP involvement, you've become kind of a local hero, right? And you stepped in. So what I would say, if you have super low cost of funds, really start cherry picking the AAA borrowers and take a haircut, because they'll be with you for a while. Long answer to a short question. I don't know what we could do about stupidity. So I don't know if that's a very good question. But I do know there's still good A borrowers out there. And if you've done a good job on driving low cost of funds, this might be the time where you give up a little price to win over that new relationship and let the other guys fight over some other bones. Sorry, that I hope that helps. So with that, let's see. And let's see what this question is. Gosh, I really don't like GoToWebinar right now. Is KRI auto input from UBPR? Oh, somebody has asked me, is key risk indicator auto input from UBPR? I think that must be a question about our system specifically. So our data sources are, we upload call report data and UBPR data. So we have a 20 million bank record database. So when the KRIs get populated in our systems, they're auto feeds. Whether it's doing comparisons with peers or your own indicators, that's driven off of our own proprietary database. But also it allows you to come up with your own KRIs and upload those into our system. So ours is a combination of public data that can be drawn from our system, or it's your own internal data. You know, things like classified to capital, you can't get that anywhere. You know, that might be something you load up. Exception monitoring, that might be something you load up. Certain transaction tick counting like CTRs and SARs and all those things, that can't be loaded. That can be uploaded into our system. But no, it doesn't come directly from UBPR. Our data does, and we do believe we have about a 99% accuracy rate. So with that, I think that's the questions for today. I hope you all got some piece of value to take away from today's session. There's a lot going on out there, and I know I did about a 30,000 foot flyover, but I hope you found some useful insights. By the way, that if you like that risk radar report, ping us every quarter. It's something we just provide all banks and credit unions for that matter if they want it, and it's a nice, really nice snapshot of where risk is going and how it's moving in your organization. So I hope you'll keep us in mind as you consider your ERM solutions and your strategy and capital. We appreciate taking time out of your busy schedule. Everybody have a great afternoon, and stay safe, and you know, continue to keep your eye on optimal performance in these tough times. Thank you. Oh, final reminder, if you haven't dropped off the phone, let us know if you want a copy of this vis-a-vis email, GoToWebinar, or a phone call. Sorry about that. Robert will kill me if I don't ask one more time for if you want a copy of the presentation. Thank you all very much. Take care.